So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Oliver Wieck. I'm the Secretary General of ICC Germany. I'm very pleased to welcome you to our workshop on how supply chain digitalization can contribute to the protection of human rights. As we are all aware, supply chains play a critical role in the global economy, connecting businesses and consumers across the world. There's a growing awareness that many of these supply chains have implications with human rights, not only in industries such as textiles, agriculture, or electronics. The digitalization of supply chains offers a powerful tool to address these challenges by providing greater transparency and traceability. Digital technologies enable companies to monitor their supply chains more effectively and identify potential risks related to human rights violations. This can include issues such as forced labor, child labor, unsafe working conditions, or environmental damages. Digitalization also facilitates the sharing of information and best practices between companies, civil society organizations, and government agencies. This collaboration can help to ensure that human rights concerns are integrated into business strategies and supply chain management processes. Moreover, digitalization can also help to more ethical supply chains by providing consumers with access to information about the products they purchase. This enables them to make informed choices based on the ethical standards of companies they buy from. However, it is also important to consider that there are limitations to digital tools. And this is what the discussion is also going to be about today. We're very fortunate to have Dorothee Baumann-Pauli accepting to moderate this discussion. She's professor at the Geneva University School of Economic and Management and directs the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights. Since 2013, she has also served as the research director at the NYU Stern Center for Business and Human Rights at the New York University. In these roles, Dorothee works with companies to advance human rights in corporate practice. Her applied research is focused on embedding human rights in organizations and developing business models that enable profits and human rights principles to coexist. Dorothee also teaches business and human rights, and she's co-edited the first textbook on business and human rights. We're happy to have you and really look forward to the discussion with Andreas Hubert, Group Chief Information Officer at Adidas, and his colleague Frank Henke, Senior Vice President for Sustainability Policy and Engagement, Dr. Thorsten Freund, Head of Project Management for the Battery Passport of the Global Battery Alliance and Corporate Technology at BASF, Janina Lucas, Head of Ethics and Social Impact at Bayer, and Dr. Tim Schulze, Policy Officer for Electronic Mobility, Alternative Drivetrains, and Environmental Innovation at the German Federal Ministry for Economics and Climate Action. I cannot wait to hear your perspectives on this challenging issue. Dear audience, take the opportunity to ask your questions to the expert via the chat, be it now or throughout the discussion. So without further ado, let us dive into the vast realm of possibilities that digitalization of trade might hold or holds for responsible and sustainable business practice. Dorothee, the floor is yours.
Oliver, thank you for the very kind introduction and for the introduction to the panel's topic today, namely how can digital tools support responsible supply chain management. I'm very keen, as you said as well, to also hear from the audience. We have a fantastic group of panelists here, but the audience should engage actively. I was told they have to use an app. I hope technology is not creating a barrier for engagement here, but I'm optimistic. And I'm very keen to have an open, forthcoming, in real conversation with everyone here today. But I also want to set 3 objectives for today's panel. First, I'm really keen to hear from the corporate representatives of the panel what digital tools are actually currently in use in their companies and how these facilitate responsible supply chain management. Second, I'm really keen to learn also about the challenges of setting up and running digital tools so that they actually create the positive impacts for workers and communities. And then the third objective is to tease out some themes that cut across multiple industries and that are relevant to consider as we hope to use more digital tools in the future and accelerate digitalization of the supply chain with entirely new tools, AI, the Internet of Things, etc. So with this, I think we're very fortunate to have with us Andreas Huppert. He's the Chief Information Officer of Adidas, and his role is, he is responsible for the digital transformation at his company. So I'm very keen to hear his opening remarks. He will set us off. It's like a warm-up exercise for what's then to come. Andreas, over to you.
Thank you, Dorothy. Yeah, my name is Andreas Huppert. I'm the CIO of Adidas, and I'm actually very grateful that you gave me the opportunity here to provide an opening statement for this panel. I joined Adidas 18 years ago, actually, in the supply chain area. And then later on in 2008, I moved to Hong Kong into the sourcing organization. And that's also where my interest for this topic, especially around social and environmental matters, has sparked. So I started out in the project team, but then took gradually on responsibility for the operational side of sourcing, accessories, footwear, and then in the end, overall sourcing. So I basically have seen all the efforts that went into changing the supply chain there. It's a very sophisticated and fragmented network. And since the late 90s, actually, companies like Adidas are putting a lot of efforts into first health and safety, but then later on, the scope was widened, looking at materials, traceability, the general human rights topics. And yeah, so I've seen the practical side of it. In the meanwhile, I've returned to Germany, and since 2020, I'm in charge of the tech organization. So now I'm partnering with the business and providing, or our team is providing solutions to many business problems. And one of those is, of course, how do we deal with the different kinds of social environmental challenges? How do we provide the right tools to enable traceability? And this is, of course, part of a wider agenda. So the topic of human rights and social environmental affairs has gained a lot of attention in the society. Key drivers, amongst others, are that our consumers are actually really paying attention to that. So 80% of the consumers expect solutions at scale from a company like Adidas. We see different trends in all the regions around the world. And of course, regulatory requirements, initiatives, they come on top. I mean, in countries like Germany, UK, Holland, France, there's a lot going on, but also in the US and Australia. And that all requires a very stringent human rights due diligence approach to deal with these. So we have to follow the UN guiding principles, OECD guidelines, all these things. I mean, you probably all know or familiar with that. The German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, of course, is also a big topic. And we have to do a lot of reporting going forward, non-financial disclosure around a lot of data points. And all these reports and data points, they have to be verified and kind of assured by independent bodies. So there's a lot of new requirements coming to companies like Adidas. And when you look at our multi-tier supply chain, when you want to ensure traceability across the entire supply chain, so for example, in the case of apparel, from cotton field to the hanger, it's a very, very complex undertaking. I think that brings us to the challenges. If you look at a supply chain like the one from Adidas, we're creating 100,000 articles every year, new articles. So it's a huge portfolio of products that all contain different materials. They are being produced and sourced in different regions and countries around the world. And providing traceability at scale actually has to go across a multi-tier supply chain network. So in Adidas, we work with around 300 suppliers on the apparel side. And each supplier, again, has what we call tier 2 suppliers. So they might work with dozens of material companies. And every material company then has a tier 3 partner network. So they're getting the yarn from different companies from different countries. And these companies have a different level of sophistication. Some of them, they're stock listed. Some of them, they are still specialists and niche suppliers, and it might be family-run small and medium-sized companies. So there's a different level of sophistication, and that combined with different documentation and disclosure standards around the world, different data that are stored in different data sources, different formats, and not last but not least, the wide variety of technology options makes the whole thing very, very complex. And I think every company has certain solutions in place. It's experimenting. The big question mark, in my opinion, is how can you actually scale up these things? We've also, some of you might be familiar with that. We are having a collection from Parley for the oceans, plastic, and the supply chain goes across 8 tier levels. And you can replicate the supply chain in a certain tool, and you can report and follow up on these things. But if you want to extend it to a different part of the supply chain, it might be very difficult. When you put yourself into the shoes of the supply base, and these are maybe the specifics of the apparel and footwear supply chain. On the footwear side especially, it's very consolidated. So there are big footwear manufacturers around the world, and they might be working with Adidas, but also with Nike and Puma. What they're facing currently is that usually the brands are all using different tools. So they might do the same work for Adidas as they do for Puma, for Nike, but they might get the material from the same source. But because of the lack of standards or common tools, the work is multiplying, and that in the end creates cost and complexity that need to be passed on to the consumers as well. So there's a lot of pressure on the supply chain from that side. What I firmly believe is that collaboration and standardization is actually the key for success in our industry, and probably in many industries. I think no company by itself or alone can overcome these challenges. It's a place where we should collaborate, not compete. I mean, sustainability, human rights, these are things that will be a hygiene factors for our consumers. It's not a differentiation factor long-term anymore. So by collaborating instead of competing, you actually can create the best level or bring everybody to the next level in the most efficient way. So we need common data standards. We need a common data language. We need to agree upon certain tracking standards. And also, I would say, industry-wide mechanisms to validate the data. And from a tool side, of course, you need to have a good tool that can report, that can follow up, document. But I think it's also about getting most of the players in the supply chain behind the same tool, so that you actually minimize the duplication of work that's involved with all the parties across the chain. And if you do that, I think then we can set up ourselves up for success. I mean, Adidas has a long-lasting track record and a history and collaboration to build smarter solutions for the industry. I mean, we're the second biggest player, and we have a strong focus on the people, on their rights and their concerns in the supply chain. And I think if there would be a coalition of the biggest players working together, agreeing on standards, agreeing on certain tools, I think we all can truly win. And I just put it out there, some food for thought. Hand back to you, Dorothy. I don't know if there are any questions or.
Thank you, Andreas. This was excellent. Your experience, of course, is highly relevant for our panel. And you're indeed providing lots of food for thought already. And these are themes we can pick up later and dive in deeper on the potential and challenges. Overall, I'd just love to hear, weighing those two sides, optimism and skepticism. Where do you land? Like, if we achieve greater collaboration and standardization around tools, are these tools eventually helpful in creating the positive impact for responsible supply chain management?
Yeah, I mean, in general, I'm an optimist. I have to say, with respect to technology, I don't have a real technology background, so I come more from the business side. But what I've seen is when you have this overwhelming choice of tools on the market, and you don't guide the players in a respective industry into a certain direction, it's just stochastics, right? Everybody picks something different, and then you create quite a mess. So I think if we get the first step right, that we align big players on all sides of the supply chain and everybody who's participating in the challenge behind something where we have a high degree of commonality. If we get that first step right, I think everything else will be a lot easier. Because when you look at the different tools and all the big software players in the industry, they're offering a solution. And reporting is easy if you have the right data. Doing simulations of the environmental impact, documenting things, there are solutions for that. The problem is, if you along the supply chain are doing things differently, it's the complexity is just multiplying, and then it's economically not viable anymore. Of course, we all want to do the right thing, but then there's an economic aspect to it as well. If you want to have a real buy-in, you need to simplify, standardize, and align behind these things. So overall, I think that's why you're having these discussions here. It's about this really the first step, getting that right. If that's the case, I'm very optimistic that this can be.
Sounds good. I understand that you have to leave us now, but I promised you we will come back to how do we get the first step right in terms of collaborating around ensuring that the tools are harmonized across industries and suppliers are not overburdened with too many requests that drive up cost. So we will discuss this question later on. I'll say goodbye to you now and turn over to the panelists. We've talked broadly about tools. Thank you, Andreas. But let's get a bit more specific. So I'm just very curious what companies are currently using to manage, what type of digital tools companies are currently using to support their responsible supply chain management strategies. And I first want to get to Janina. Janina, she's the head of ethics and social impact at Bayer, and she has been instrumental in building up the sustainability supplier program in the company. So have you used digital tools to do this, and how are they facilitating your work? Janina, over to you.
Thanks, Dorothy, and also for bringing us here together. Before I'm going a little bit more into detail what tools we're using, actually I'd like to break it down a bit, because we're hearing tools, we are hearing digitalization, but what is it what we are talking about? Are these tools, are these platforms where different entities may log in and enter certain data? Are these tools that are facilitating transparencies? Are these platforms where you may find webinars, trainings, materials that could be used on scale for training, for creating awareness? The landscape is pretty broad, and it is broad for good reasons, because companies need different tools, different measures to be effective. When we're looking at Bayer and our supply chain, we are also using different means in order to reach our suppliers. We are working with online tools when it comes to sustainability assessments. We are working here with a digital service provider, it's EcoVadis, who is designing an online platform, designing online questionnaires where suppliers are invited to fill in their status quo, how they are managing certain sustainability topics. Human rights is among them, but also environmental and other topics. And this platform, they can multiply. It's not only exclusive for us, the answers they are preparing, but they can be distributed to other companies as well. We are also using, because it's a nice tool for general management oversight, but to really come to the ground, we are still using other tools, which are audits, where we are using the human component very strong in order to have real eyes and ears on the ground to audit a situation really at the side of supplier. But these are then in the end transferred into a digital medium and then shared also through other industry initiatives, through other online tools with other companies. Means the first attempt is manually, but then it can be used and multiplied as well. And we are also using these industry initiatives. They are called Pharmaceutical Supply Chain Initiative and Together for Sustainability, for creating online platforms for also leveraging on scale training materials, raising awareness for suppliers so that they can log in and use materials that is already provided. So it's different tools we're using. And the part what we internally have as well is to bring it all together, because this is another topic where we need to be really open and honest about it. There's a lot of information, but people need to make use of the information. They need to know where the information is. They need to know how to interpret that information and combine it with their day-to-day go-to tool. And we built that ourselves because we didn't find anything on the market years ago that could help us. So we created an own online medium for having supplier data merged with sustainability data, training materials, so that we have that one tool that can be used then by our sourcing managers, because they are the one who need to have that information and not need to do the investigation through the entire company to find where the information is stored. As said, we are going from online assessments, on-site audits, transferring it into online means, tools we are sharing with other companies to leverage our expertise and tools on scale.
Janina, thanks. You raised a number of really important points, and indeed tools are used for different purposes, and you, I think, drew nice differentiations between tools that help to manage suppliers and social audits, databases, but also training platforms where you can share knowledge and expertise with others. So of course, there are digital tools that have entirely different purposes. Another thing you said, which I thought was very important, which we should pick up in a moment again, is that the fact that data got digitalized on one hand helps to share the data, but it also creates more and more data, and we have to make sure that it doesn't lead to data, that we're not overwhelmed by the data, but that we figure out ways to connect the dots the right way, and we interpret the existing data in a way that's actually useful. And did I understand this correctly, that you created your own system for doing this?
For bringing the data together, yes, for the sustainability part.
Yeah.
Where I also see more potential is to broaden up the sustainability, like really the classical environmental and social topics, by other topics out there. When I'm looking on anti-corruption, when I'm looking on resilience overall, whenever there is resilience risk, there's most likely also a linked proxy for people, and maybe also at risk when it comes to their health, their safety. When I'm looking on anti-corruption, there are also different people working on it, on those tools, those data, those risk scores, but they are also linked to other environmental and social topics. So we build that for our sustainability part, and are also looking broader into where do we have where could it correlate with others, where is already another information out there, because as you rightly said, there is a lot of data already out there, but there also need to be people who are aware of it and who are using it. Otherwise we have data, but no actions. Indeed,
and interpret it in a way that allows us to have deeper insights into social and environmental risks. Great, let's hear from Frank, who can complement the remarks from his colleague Andreas on how Adidas uses digital tools to date to manage supply chain responsibly. Frank, I don't want to make you sound old, but you're a true veteran. You've also seen the development of global supply chain management over multiple decades. We met more than 20 years ago, and at the time, digitalization of the supply chain really wasn't a big topic yet. Now it's such a hot topic, also because legislation really requires companies to go very deep into supply chains, and that, of course, has accelerated a development that you witnessed very closely. So I'm keen to hear from you how you see this development and where you are right now, and how you see that this has helped to actually manage supply chains.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Dorothee, and more than happy to comment on your questions. And as Andreas said in his intro statement, as a company which is truly consumer facing, we have been imposed to the discussion about human rights and environmental due diligence already since mid of the 90s, when the first let's say, not saying campaigns, but where we have been seeing a tremendous interest in this topic. And we as a consumer-facing company had to cope with this. And that required, from our side, quite a steep learning curve in developing a large-scale human rights and environmental due diligence program in a relative short period of time, saying that we had to ramp up a program which was targeting on our first-tier suppliers. And if I look back into the late 90s and the early 2000s, I mean, the situation was totally different as we face nowadays. I mean, the progress which has been made by our supplier partners has been tremendous, you know. And you, of course, you can discuss what have been the driving forces behind this, who had played a critical role on this. But what is really critical, that to be able to manage such a large-scale program, you need digital solutions to oversee supplier performance, to oversee specific key performance indicators you have set for your business partners, and to track them to see if they are on the right track or on the right path, and to integrate that in the overall supplier performance assessment approach, which as Adidas has been doing for many years. The other topic which we looked into is all topics in regards to traceability. And there can't be sustainability without traceability, in particular for a company like ours, I mean, heavily relying on an outsourced supply chain. And of course, we have been looking into various options. And for us, I would say it was a 20-year plus learning exercise. And I even would say, and again, would like to stress what Andrea was saying, we are not at the end of the journey. Like many other of our industry peers, we have focused on the development of own systems. Of course, always very carefully differentiating for what purpose we have been applying this. For example, for managing all the labor-related or social compliance-related data, we have been joining the Fair Factory Clearinghouse at a very, very early stage. We took advantage from the fact that one of our former subsidiaries, Reebok, had invested into that tool. And we found that there are so many opportunities in terms of driving collaboration with other brands who we shared factories with, could help us to be smarter in the way how we organized factory visits, how we shared specific information to avoid the so-called audit fatigue many of the suppliers are facing. We have developed very specific tools for measuring and managing our carbon footprint. Of course, in our own operations, which I would say it's a simpler exercise, but when we look at the so-called scope 3, we are heavily reliant on the input from our supplier factories, and we have been developing a carbon footprint plus tool, which allows our core business partners, tier 1s and strategic tier 2s, to upload their data on a monthly basis, which really helps us to calculate and to simulate our total company footprint. We have been proceeded also looking into life cycle tools dedicated and targeted to specific products. And here we have to overcome the challenge of so-called primary data we are capturing through our own program, because we have people on the ground who are supporting us, as well as so-called secondary data lakes. Data from parts of our supply chain we do not have direct access to. And then we need to combine this to generate a meaningful outcome. And last but not least, of course, addressing the topic of traceability in those parts of our business where a complete chain of custody is absolutely critical, specifically looking into areas of cotton or what Andreas has been saying, partly ocean plastics. Here we wanted to know where the plastics has been collected from the junk shops, let's say, through the factory who was basically processing the recycled plastics up to the manufacturing. So these are the approaches we have been doing, tailored the needs and by looking into the specific digital solutions. But as I said, we are not at the end. We are in the process of finding the right approach.
Thanks, Frank. Clearly an impressive evolution. And I think it's important that you state here at the very beginning, it's not a question of whether or not to use digital tools. It doesn't work without digital tools, given the complexity of your supply chain, et cetera. I want to, one follow-up question to you, Frank. In my research, I've often highlighted how business models drive systemic human rights risks into supply chains, particularly in the context of the garment supply chain. And we have seen that oftentimes subcontracting is the norm and not the exception. And so in interviews with manufacturers, we sometimes heard that brands place orders that exceed the production capacity of a supplier. So that's a data point that a brand actually should have handy. And so as you place an order, to me, I'm wondering, isn't that a case where, you know, the data exists, but the dots are not connected? Do you want to comment on that? How this works?
I mean, the topic of, and we call it unauthorized subcontracting, because we basically expect from our business partners to fully disclose their subcontract supply chain and to provide also reasons why they have to subcontract in specific orders. Because this goes hand in hand with the capacity planning. And this is also a part of our so-called responsible purchasing practices, that we on the one hand want to provide our business partners with utmost stability and clarity in terms of order placement so that our first-tier suppliers can plan with it. On the other hand, we expect them to be as honest and transparent in sharing with us under which instances they have to work with subcontractors. And they are part of our audit approach. So every subcontractor doing full garment is part or subject of an, let's say, of an inspection or an assessment process, and we deal and we cope with these subcontractors exactly the same way as we deal with our tier ones. One final comment, which I forgot to mention, is in regards to complaint management, Dorothy. And here we have invested a lot, even in terms of digital solutions. Already back in 2014, we have rolled out an app-based worker complaint system because we still believe that listening to workers or building channels to workers directly is a very important addendum to any physical or desktop assessment approach you do, because this gives you a much realistic pattern or scheme about a factory. So we are heavily relying on our worker complaint system, which is actually covering 500,000 workers in our supply chain, which I do think it's pretty scale, but it really helps us to identify issues of concern, if it's systemic or individual, but it's a helpful tool, I can say.
Absolutely, and that's an important area. Workers all have a cell phone nowadays.
Exactly.
So you can actually use an app to report cases and bring them to your attention. Thanks, Frank. Let's move on to two gentlemen that can provide us with a very concrete example of digitalization in the supply chain, how digital tools hopefully help to advance human rights and environmental standards in the battery supply chain. I first want to talk to Torsten Freund. He's the head of project management for the Battery Passport, co-leads with the Global Battery Alliance. And Torsten, you describe yourself as a techie. So I'm happy that we have one real tech expert here. So take us down that rabbit hole, but go slow. So first, explain to the audience what this Battery Passport is and what tools are used within that program to advance social and environmental responsibility.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for having me here, Dorothy, and this interesting discussion. And all what has been said really resonates with the daily experience. Now the question is, how can we get all these good ideas to the ground and make it a handleable process and a program that can be of use for not only industry, but also for society. Let me come back a little bit of the history of Global Battery Alliance. This initiative was formed 2017 under the World Economic Forum, when a couple of CEOs came together and said, hey, we are striving here for the energy transformation. and batteries will certainly play a big role in that. However, we know if you are producing batteries on an industrial scale with huge capacities, you're facing all the issues of the supply chain. And this supply chain does not exist today and has to be built up. However, if we build the supply chain up, that should be right from the beginning, respecting environmental, social, and governance aspects. And okay, how can you build this in? So you need a tool for monitoring and measuring what is the practice being executed on the ground. And that's how the battery passport idea came to life, which I have the privilege to accompany for the past 3 years. So the first thing what we have discovered was, how can we report on an unambiguous, standardized, but still differentiating manner with accurate data, which can be used for differentiation of good practice and not so good practice. Looking into the landscape, there are enormous number of standards which look at the same thing but are not really the same. And the individual players in the value chain are confronted with this complexity of how to report if we just talk about the qualities. Then you have the supply chain due diligence. We have heard it from Bayer, from Adidas, and there's hundreds of companies in the tier 1 who are running the same programs, and they come to the poor supplier in the upstream value chain who has to report on a little bit of different format to all those requests. So consequently, the standardization of reporting will provide more transparency and will reduce the effort for the individual participating, so make it handleable. The same story holds true for legislation. We have an enormous amount of international legislation, which is sometimes equivalent, sometimes contradictory even. So that has to be brought on an interoperable level. And that's interoperability is basically my second keyword. We need to negotiate with all the affected parties to become interoperable, so that we're talking about the same things which can interface in the perspective of content. That means that we are clearly defining what we are talking about, as well as in the terms of the digitization of those data. So how we approached it is that we have chosen 2 guinea pigs. We have recognized that greenhouse gas footprint can be reported in various ways with a lot of ambiguity. Therefore, the Global Battery Alliance has set out to clearly articulate the rules and the metrics for the entire value chain, from the mine where the first raw materials are collected, through all the processing steps of the materials, through the manufacturing of battery cells, and basically the battery we place in our cars or we use for the storage in our homes or for the industry. With that tool in place, we have now an agreeable reporting format. That was complicated enough because you need to adjust your metrics according to what people want to see. And there is a huge difference between what regulators want to see, what civil society representation wants to see, and what industry needs to see to manage their processes. Same story for human rights. That started out with the notion of cobalt in the upstream value chain, which is one of the main risk areas for child labor. So how do you report about child labor, given that there is tons of different standards which are not equivalent? So we have set out to take all these standards, look at the provisions and projection to a common scale, and report according to this common scale by a scoring model. Okay, very theoretical so far, very technical. However, if you want to see whether this theoretical concept works, just do it. And that's what we have set up over the past year. We've taken 4 supply chains and applied those tools, worked together with those service providers who provide information technology tools, and took the reporting on this tool and condensed them through the entire value chain to a battery passport. So the proof of concept is there. However, now it's the time how to scale it up, make it handleable. And here we have those 2 key challenges: to have an accurate and understandable reporting, plus to make it interoperable, that all parties agree for managing supply chains rather than just reporting for the sake of data, but we want to drive change on the ground. And that's where even Tim Schulz's department comes in for doing the backbone. We have a funded project called the Battery Pass. It's German consortium, which is really going down in the workshop and defining all the nitty-gritty details, which we want to merge as one common system, which is providing the interoperability and manage the ESG data.
Torsten, thanks. The Global Battery Alliance, of course, is an ideal platform for standardization because it's a multi-stakeholder platform. I have a question, hopefully tech enough, about the actual data. From a human rights perspective, data is often difficult to quantify. So greenhouse gas emissions, there's a number. Simple. And that fits neatly into digital tools that exist. The qualitative data that you often have in the human rights space, where we're often operating in the gray area. It's not as black and white, and you cannot really as easily assign a number to it. Are probably harder to capture for a digital tool. How have you dealt with that difficulty?
Yeah, exactly.
Context.
Yeah, exactly. So we have tried to make a qualitative assessment just by dissecting all the individual things, what you can do as a provision to avoid child labor, the management processes, the risk assessment, the mitigation measures or grievance mechanisms, and all those steps have been qualified by individual questions. Which processes or which measures do you execute in your business? And by scoring those methods, you get a good indication of the more measures a company is executing, the higher is the standard. And we're still working on how can we differentiate between the individual provisions that we have the must and the, let's say, nice to have, or let's say the additional improvement, the aspirational, thank you for the word, the aspirational ones. This is still work ongoing, but this is now then the question, how to scale it up and make it really meaningful to provide the information to drive the change on the ground.
Yeah, it's a really ambitious agenda, but certainly you have all the critical actors across the battery supply chain at the table. I'm now keen to hear from Tim how he, in his role as policy officer for electric mobility, alternative drivetrains, and environmental innovation at the ministry, provides the backbone for this project. Tell us more about that, Tim.
Yes, thanks for having me, first of all, and hello to the audience and the fellow panelists. Yes, I'm happy to do so. So in our ministry, there is a focus in our unit, as well as in the ministry in general, on setting up a European supply chain for batteries for some years now. So quite obviously, we're scaling up electric mobility. A huge part of value creation is in the battery, as well as the definition of how much contribution can there actually be to CO2 reduction in the electric vehicle, because the main part of the so-called built-in CO2 is in the battery. So we need to control the conditions under which batteries are manufactured. And plus, there are numerous challenges. The child labor problem with cobalt was mentioned. There's a number of other environmentally challenging components in the battery, quite obviously. So we are sure, and not only us, but other member states, the European Commission, that we would need to control the conditions of battery production. And if we were to set up a successful domestic value chain for batteries in the EU, we also need to think about distinctive factors. So I think we cannot hope to compete on a global level just on price. So it is also quite clear that we need to strive for the best sustainability by every possible measure. for the batteries to be produced here in Europe. And with this in mind, it was clear early on that transparency would be a core component of that. So we just don't to claim that. We also need to measure that in a reliable and verifiable manner. And there comes the battery passport into play. And you might be aware that since a few months we have a final version of the EU battery regulation that even puts the battery passport into a regulatory framework. So there will be the need for a cross-cutting, and with cross-cutting I mean along the value chain, information system that gathers information along the production steps of a battery, that tracks data, also usage data, to facilitate a number of things, and firstly to guarantee that the battery has been produced the most sustainable way in terms of human rights, but also in terms of environmental sustainability. But the passport will also enable, for example, repairability of batteries, or recyclability, because a recycler will know what exactly is in the battery, what's its chemical composition, what has it seen during its life. Can I use it in a storage system on the grid, or do I need to scrap it? So all these information will be in there. And so we as the ministry have been working on this topic, I would say on two levels. So on the regulatory level, of course, we were in contact with other member states, with the EU Commission and their responsible bodies in the discussions around the regulation, which, as I said, came to an end in December with the final text. But we were also moving and pushing this topic in the domain of funding. So there is different ways we're doing this. We have seconded experts from an agency that we contract to the Global Battery Alliance to support the staffing there for the battery passport. And as Thorsten Freund has just mentioned, we also kicked off a national funding project called Battery Pass. Well, it's not very creative, but self-explanatory. That indeed has the task to create a working prototype implementation of that. So the GBA is on a little higher level, creating the standards, the rules that shall be implemented on a global level. We are with this other project looking toward a European perspective to move forward as Germany with a concrete proposal for a working implementation of a paper that fits the requirement of the upcoming regulation. And we are, last but not least, also with another project supporting the standardization efforts around the battery pass, or digital product passports in general. And this was mentioned by my fellow panelists as well, the importance of having standards, quite obviously. And so we are also trying to push and to help there. And last but not least, we are also having more generic projects working towards European cloud infrastructures. Mm-hmm. And this ideally could also work as a generic platform on which passports for different domains, battery passport, but maybe also in other domains, could in the end be implemented using the same framework, so to say, and hopefully also the same data exchange standards. So these are the different angles at which we're looking at this topic as the ministry.
Tim, thanks. Very interesting. The audience, of course, will not all be working on products in the battery supply chain. So I'm in a conversation we had before this panel, you said you're not in charge of the German Supply Chain Act. However, certainly that piece of legislation affects all companies in Germany and beyond. So for the battery context, we have a very concrete reference point at the EU level with the battery directive, and the battery passport is a pilot that you're supporting. And I'm wondering if that pilot, if you could imagine that the ministry also creates similar projects for other industries, also in the context of the German Supply Chain Act. Is this a pilot that you think can translate to other sectors?
A very, very good question. Not for me to decide, but well, let's look at it from a different angle. So we know that on the European level, the battery passport is very closely being followed by the Commission and their services, because the battery value chain is seen as a prototype industry in the framework of digital product passports in general. So we really hope to lay the groundwork here with both the works of the GBA as well as of this national project in terms of exchange standards, of an IT infrastructure that is beyond all that, as a scaffold that can be used also in other industries. And we know that for the Commission, as I said, is one of three prototype sectors. The others are electronics and textiles, and there is also a European project to which we have linked our project quite closely, that tries to find synergy between these sectors, and so we hope to feed in also into this European effort with the works that we are supporting right now. So I hope that this generalization is already work at the European level. So as for us and other sectors, of course, we will monitor closely what is happening, and if we have the impression that there is a gap to be filled, I think we are standing by. But I wouldn't want to commit to any particular action here.
Sure, of course. Thank you. I want to stay a little bit with the battery passport as sort of the as a deep example for how digital tools facilitate the management of global supply chains. Torsten, you said there's proof of concept now. This works, but you also mentioned to me that there are many challenges that remain, including scaling, etc. But why don't you, elaborate on the challenges on the way and also going forward, and maybe end your statement with a question back to Tim that highlights how the ministry could further support the Global Battery Alliance to overcome these challenges.
Definitely. So the proof of concept has just shown on a few value chains and a few examples that we can linearly process data through an entire value chain, let's say from cradle to gate.
Yeah.
Now the question is, how can we extend this to the full life of the product? So the use life of a battery in a car or in an industrial or private use. And more importantly, how can we use the tracing and tracking of a battery passport to close the recycling loop quantitatively, not only for one battery, but for hundreds of millions of batteries which enter the market if we are thinking this forward. So just a few numbers, we have 1.4 billion vehicles on the ground currently, and every year 110 million vehicles are being produced. So this is the number of data we need to deal with. And that's an enormous part. For a database that would be too much. Therefore, we need to develop decentralized models. And therefore, the standardization, cloud technologies are at stake, which are not yet developed to this grade of maturity. So we have, on the one hand, the vision. On the other hand, we need still to invest in technology development to scale it up from a very few examples to thousands or millions of items to be tracked and traced. And especially for the regulators to monitor and steer for the market conformity assessment. So that's one challenge. The other challenge is this topic of digital product passports attracts a lot of attention, and thus people who see either business or value from the civil society angle in that. So consequently, many initiatives are emerging, and these many initiatives think they have all a solution which is viable. We see that the great challenge here is how to organize all those solutions. We see then the funding comes from the European Commission, comes from the German government. And my question, if I would like to bring this back to Tim, how can we ensure that the national initiatives are aligned with the European ones? And in the perspective, even extended into the global ones, where we see solutions in China, as well as emerging in Costa Rica or in the US.
Over to you, Tim.
Okay, take that. Well, as for European harmonization, I would say the distances are reasonably small, so that we can ensure, just by talking to each other, that we have a certain level of alignment, and we do not, create too much overlap or do things twice. I think this is ensured. We have an advisory council which comes together this Friday, by the way, to the battery pass project, making sure that it is linked to the appropriate other institutions and projects. There is also a personal overlap, by the way, because there's not so many institutions dealing with these topics, which leads to the fact that they appear in different projects. So I think on the European level, that's more or less fine. The international level, that's the tricky bit, of course, and we are at the moment already bilaterally with a number of governments to talk about sort of minimum standards of data exchange, because this is obviously a very important topic, that we do not create a solitaire here in something which just works here, while the company is subjected to other legislation and the other standards elsewhere. And it is probably not realistic that we'll have the same set of requirements in all the markets. We are already seeing this in our conversations with other governments. So there might be a focus on CO2 here, or on local content elsewhere. But I think this could be fine. But we need to make sure that the standards under which these systems operates are the same, so that we have one system, or at least a workable interface, a data exchange standard that makes sure that the work on company level is not fragmented in very different markets. And conversations we're having, but there's not so many fora where this makes sense. You cannot talk to 200 states at the same time. So we need to focus on the most important markets. First, there are diverging interests, of course, in some of those. But that's a nut we would like to crack in the coming months.
Sounds like you are working together, and nevertheless, Frank has a direct, please.
Yeah, or a direct comment to Tim and to Thorsten. And it would be really great if the German ministry could convey the message of further alignment, at least within Europe, to the Commission, because as you are aware, I mean, there are a number of legal initiatives in the pipeline who are going to require digital product passports for other product categories, specifically also for textile and footwear under the Eco-Design for Sustainable Product Directive, which is actually discussed and debated by the industry together with other stakeholders. And here it's really important what the scope is going to be. Is it, as you described, Tim, to provide clear direction for the collectors and sorters and the recyclers of the world to handle the products in the right way, to feed them back into, let's say, into a circle? Or will it cover or mirror as a digital twin the entire life cycle of a product, starting from the origin of the specific materials, semi-finished products, full product like garment or footwear, up to the end? And this is of critical importance, that we are going to achieve a common denominator, what the digital product passport is going to cover very, very soon, because then we can look into what is already there. And there are manifold individual systems being developed, even in the footwear, in the sporting goods industry, to support this process. But that would really help us to focus and to tailor our efforts to what is basically required. But bottom line is, whatever system and approach we are going to develop, it should really lead to change in terms of impact. And here again, I come to that point of data quality. And I'm very thankful to you, Dorothy, because you have been asking the question, how to manage that diverse type of data qualities. I mean, the environmental stuff, easy to handle because it's very much driven by numerical data. But in terms of human rights, we're talking about people, we're talking about privacy topics, we're talking about highly volatile dynamic processes, where as far as I can see, still we are still looking for the key to the castle, you know, and this needs to be considered in any system to be developed, because otherwise we run into the problem, garbage in, garbage out.
Frank, I agree, but I also have one last follow-up question to our global battery team. In my research, I have focused on a part of the battery supply chain that is currently not yet in the scope of the Global Battery Alliance. My focus was on artisanal small-scale mining. Why? Because in this part of the supply chain, the human rights risks are the greatest. This is where fatal mining accidents happen every day. This is where child labor is very common. And from a sort of perspective, where do we start if we're serious about addressing human rights in a global supply chain? From my perspective, we should start where the risks are the greatest. And in the cobalt supply chain that I analyzed with great detail, clearly artisanal small-scale mining is where we should then start. If we apply that logic, in the DRC, the artisanal small-scale production of cobalt makes between 15 to 30% of the cobalt that's then exported and refined in the DRC and China, and eventually goes into cars and electronics. So it's not a side note in that supply chain. Yet the Global Battery Alliance and the passport has decided to not include it in scope. Can you explain why?
I would contradict the notion that we have decided not to include it in scope. We have recognized that this is an extremely complicated and complex issue. Because we cannot use the same standards which we use for the industrial mining part. And we're at the moment developing ideas, how can we really understand what's going on and report on an unambiguous way what's going on in the artisanal small-scale mining. So at the moment we're exploring as well some projects which are at very early stage, which are dealing with how can we monitor the conditions on the ground. It doesn't have to make super provisions. An artisanal company is not formalized, that it has a reporting department which can you provide with the data and the audits. And that is putting two questions in the game. Number one is how can we use our data management with the state of the art, what it is like. And the other aspect is, would it make sense to change the status on the ground, that we are moving from a completely informal artisanal small-scale mining sector to a more formalized one? Can we introduce systems which help the people on the ground to improve their conditions of life and then can report about those? And that makes, that's the extremely difficult part. How much do we need to change the system rather than just reporting about it? What brings income to people? What makes a family stable? What prevents the parents sending their children to the mine to feed them or to gain the income to feed them, rather than how can we find income mechanisms for families that can sustain the children, so better send the kids to school rather than into the mine? And this is a completely open question. We see a couple of projects. I believe, Dorothy, you reported about one in your research. We have the Cobalt for Development, which is run by GAZ, supported by a couple of companies. giving the money for this experiment, but we need to see the outcome of these experiments that we can then look into how to integrate it into a reporting system, really to drive the change on the ground. And I believe that we all agree that child labor is one of the most immediate risks we need to extinguish, rather than just report about that there is no child in the mine. We need to go to the root causes.
Yeah, thank you. It's really encouraging to hear that you put that out on the horizon to eventually get to this and include it as well. Janina, you've been listening intently for a long time. I also know that you have many things to bring up when it comes to, to discuss the challenges of digital tools. And I want to ask you specifically about what you think, whether human rights due diligence, which really requires a participatory approach with rights holders, can be advanced through digital tools. Do you think it's a bridge potentially, or is it creating obstacles? I know this is something dear to your heart. So why don't you offer your perspective on the inclusiveness that may or may not be created through digital tools?
And thanks for pointing that. So the inclusiveness and not losing the focus on the people is so essential. And you commented already on it. You also, Torsten, also Frankie also talked about that these are people and not a carbon number or a KPI, which is a number, but it's a qualitative a qualitative, often systematic issue behind it. And even if maybe you have more clear indications when it comes to child labor, when you could look on passports ID if existing, we are talking about other topics like forced labor, where there is not that one sign that yes, this is not forced labor, but it's often a combination of abuse of power, excessive working hours linked to really threats, etc. So how do we want to squeeze this into a number? I really like to ask those questions. Do we really want to squeeze this into a number and then becoming entities that are checking numbers on it? Or do we want to be really knowledgeable, building up a muscle, and then using tools that could help you becoming better, becoming faster, becoming more transparent in what you're doing? Because this is where I see challenges and a lot of risk, that there is a huge focus on and the belief on that IT tools will solve all issues. Don't get me wrong, tools can help facilitating work, making it more efficient and honestly also more fun to work with. But there are many steps before to be done, and they also need to be done when the tools are out there. Companies need to really understand what are my biggest risks, and not only looking naively on country risk scores. Country risk scores could give an indication on labor rights, on rights of joining an association, but they completely miss the single supplier, the single entity, and really the endeavor of companies to become better. If we are looking only on numbers, you are missing really the chance to go there where it's maybe not that easy, and to improve, to work with the people. And a person is not a number, a person is meeting them where they are. And it can be that, yes, maybe a company is located in a country where the state of law is at risk, or where certain labor rights are not yet enacted. However, you have good examples of companies, and you need to find them. And then you need to use tools to make it more to make it more transparent. So tools, I believe, yes, we need them, but there's homework which will be done or should be done also upfront by building up muscles and knowledge, because otherwise we are playing numbers and missing our empathy for the people who should benefit from it. That's why also, Frank, you've been talking about the tool you've been inventing on the complaints mechanism with the workers' voices. These are so great examples that this is feasible. Is this combined with effort? Yes, but then you really get all time the insights, what is happening after a certificate had been handed out after auditors are leaving a facility, to have also tools that enable people conveying how they are seeing a situation without others being around and building up an atmosphere of pressure where nobody is speaking up. So it can, to your questions, Dorothee, yes, human rights due diligence is on scale not working without digitalization and tools. However, human rights due diligence is not digitalization and tools. These are pillars that could be used and merged into it.
That's clear. And I just look at Frank. I know he wants to comment more on this. So Frank.
Yeah. I mean, regardless how good the tool is, it remains an enabler. I mean, on the other hand, I think we also need to take into account the positive side of tech solutions. I mean, the way how they have spurred public awareness. I mean, we are becoming aware much faster of issues which are happening in our supply chain compared to years ago, thanks to social media, thanks to access of workers to smartphones, to apps, and the connection to organizations. And I mean, let's face it, I mean, media campaigns or campaigns of the civil society are much more powerful and reach much more people than any newspaper can basically reach. I mean, just taking into account, I mean, the advantage or the benefits in mobilizing and activating awareness for this topic. And as a company, I mean, being, as I said, so consumer facing, I mean, it can mean a lot of pain, but it's better to know, and then to know what is specifically happening, which allows us to do then as an investigation to substantiate claims, instead of going into the dark, reading a report which has not declared, let's say, the origin of the complaint, you know. So what I want to say is, I mean, any specific information which is provided us helps us to do a better job in investigating and finding or supporting a resolution. And that's so critical to drive impact on the ground, as Janina was saying.
And Frank, you also mentioned to me the important role of trust in these tools. I've had conversations with companies that are offering, for example, a grievance channel through an app, and they then proudly tell me, we had hardly any cases, so things are going really well, which may, however, also mean potentially that it's not going well and the app is just not adopted and trusted and actually used. So it may actually be a good sign if you get a lot of cases through such digital tools versus very few. So do you want to say another word on the role of trust and how you're helping, as Janina points out, that the human touch to actually create an enabling environment for these tools to work?
Yeah. And again, I think the ambition always must be to bring the program as close as possible to the people being impacted or affected. I mean, looking at the results from our complaint system we have rolled out, and we publicly report about this on an annual basis, we are receiving around about 60,000 complaints. 60,000. Also, we can say, I mean, 1/3 it's general questions about, I didn't understand the corporate policy, I didn't understand my paycheck, I didn't understand the latest rules in regards to working hours. The other part is very personal. It's about people getting homesick, and very personal topics. Yeah. And then the other third is really about, I would call it something which you really need to do a deep dive, because there could be a reason or root cause for an issue, you know. But it's interesting how widely these channels are being used by people. But this requires a lot of upskilling, training, and support by our business partners. And by the way, they also have one additional advantage. They have an additional communication tool to their workforces. In many countries where we operate, there are lack in effective communication channels from the management to the workforce. And through that app, they also can use it in providing notifications, which is relevant for the entire workforce.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Janina, you have your hand up.
Yeah, because I like to exactly come into the point you're discussing. Trust, how should you trust a tool when you don't know who is behind the tool, who invented it, who is getting the data? I mean, people being based and raised in Germany are generally very sensitive when it comes to data. Why should we believe that others should kindly give us their data without fear of retaliation, etc.? There are concerns that need to be acknowledged and addressed. And when I'm seeing that there are big initiatives ongoing funded, I often missing the people who should be involved in it, like people from the global south, the source of raw materials. They are often not playing a direct role. I know it's incredible and hard, but to be to get the results we want to see, I think there's no way around to involve them either by direct rights holder engagement or through means by civil society organizations. Transparency may be a little bit different when it really comes only for the mapping, but when it comes to tools that are talking about raising awareness, when it comes to empowerment, when it comes to engagement, how to engage if you're not engaged up front, how should this work? I haven't seen that this is effective, and this is something which is gladly, I'm very happy actually about this, asked also by the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, because they're not looking for more tools and measures, but for those who are effective. And the reality shows the tools that are effective are the ones where people are involved upfront and not only by coming in at a very late stage, filling out a survey.
Yeah, so it's no replacement for that, clearly. Yeah. Torsten, you wanted to contribute?
Yeah, I would like to build on what Janina just outlined. So it's first, of course, it's about people. Second thing is about, if we're talking about data related to people, it's a big question around data governance, which is not solved yet. So in the end, who sees which data on which aggregation level? That's a discussion we still need to lead in order to bring the change to the people who need it, but also respect their rights in terms of the individual and the protection of their personal data. And the other aspect of trust is how to verify data. So we think a lot about how can audits be organized? How can audits be organized to be mutually recognized rather than each company sending out an armada of auditors and creating so much audit effort that the companies in the upstream cannot work anymore, and then translate such mutually recognized audits into the digital space. So how can we ensure that the observation on the ground is transformed digitally and verified that it cannot be changed on the way from, let's say, the Suri in Turkey into the shop in Mannheim? So all these questions are still reflecting in there, and this is more a journey rather than a project.
Torsten, if I may add, I'd also be interested in exploring what are the economic incentives for putting genuine data into these tools, or authentic data. Because if there are no incentives, then we have the problem that Frank pointed out earlier, garbage in, garbage out. We're not getting the real picture of what's going on the ground. I want to get to questions from the audience, and I encourage the audience to send a few more. There's a fantastic question from Ekaterina Freidenberg. She wants to know, how does data exchange actually work inside of corporations, and would love to hear from Adidas Bayer, maybe also BASF, how they build up relevant knowledge, data analysis among the involved departments. Does each team have a data specialist across to then connect the points across departments? I think it's a great point. Janina, do you want to go first?
Do I understand it correctly, asking how we are building up our own systems to connect the dots, to share the information?
I think this is...
Okay, good. Then no, we don't have data analysts in all departments. we joined forces very strong. This was in my time when I've been working within the procurement team with our IT colleagues who are behind our data, who can help building up systems. Because back then we didn't find anything good on the market, let's be honest, in case there would have been a solution which we can dynamically plug into our systems, we would have gone for that. But it was simply not existing. We saw some tools that you buy for one time, but it's like static, and then you have it for 1 year, but then you're lost the next years. So we teamed up with our IT specialists to help us putting in all our demands, and we run a hard learning curve, like how to speak the same language, procurement colleagues and IT colleagues. After a painful learning course, we found a language we could align on, and then building up a module. But it took many, many months. It was nothing that was there after 2 meetings. It took many months, many test trials, building interfaces to asset providers, for example. Now it's running, and now we have the people maintaining the data, but they are not a data analysts. They are procurement professionals and trained in analyzing our data.
Frank is nodding.
Yeah, and Janina, I'm very grateful that you provided a kind of a reality check how long it takes to build up the necessary systems. And at our side, we have dedicated people who run the specific programs, for example, supply chain facing, social and environmental affairs program. They are experts, program experts, but they were extremely supportive in finding the right from-the-shelf tool. For, as I mentioned, our work we have done with the Fair Factory Clearinghouse, which operates as our backbone for uploading all social and social compliance data, which is a good hub and platform to even to share that with others. And we do all the analytics based on this. On the environmental side, we have footprint analysts, LCA experts who helped us and advised the company to invest in the right tools or to build up even our own tools. And for other areas like non-trade procurement, we also have decided, based on the expertise we have in-house, which from-the-shelf solution we are going for. So that has been the approach. We have dedicated people, but rather driven from the program side, from the need side, and then of course asking the tech guys to help us in integrating this into our systems.
That's interesting. So there has been a lot of development inside companies to create systems that allow to interpret each other's data and connect the dots. But I'm also wondering, what data do you request from your suppliers, and has this changed over time? Because now we have, the Internet of Things, and I'm thinking of a context, Frank, where, for example, I believe we could use the data of the sewing machines, and assess how long they run, to then cross-check with records of hours of work to see, does this match up? If the machine is running in the middle of the night, but no hours are recorded, something looks fishy and should raise flags, and someone should then probably go and investigate. But is there any real life data that you're able to collect from your suppliers to date? Not, because audits, I've worked for the Fair Labor Association, I've trained auditors. You always have this time gap of like
exactly
12 months, and then you check in again. So you don't know what happens in between. But now I think there are more data opportunities as well to maybe in real time check live what's happening at each production site. Is this something you are already doing or requiring from your suppliers?
Dorothy, honestly, that is a territory I think we have to elaborate and explore further, and more than happy to take that offline with you and taking up your ideas and your learnings.
You mentioned earlier, but it's not the end of the journey. So I'm trying to sort of put something out there where the journey might lead to.
Yeah, that would at least allow us not to send people to specific factories to check if they are managing their night shift in a proper way in terms of overtime. Yeah, I mean, there are definitely opportunities in it, but for the time being, we have not really activated that, and that's why I said, I mean, let's do a follow up. More than happy, super excited about it.
Great. Sounds good. There's a question in the chat, which I think I want to give to Tim. It's coming from Helena Peltonen-Gassmann, Transparency Germany. How can civil society at the mining locations contribute to reliable, stable capture of the situation? Basically, how can we integrate data from civil society into passports, I suppose? And Thorsten, if you know.
Well, I maybe just wants to chime in. Well, that's a tricky one. Obviously, civil society can help to authenticate a picture which is drawn by business actors, right? So they act in the native environments, and to check on opinions of civil society might be an important indicator, as we've just heard. Also, would be checking in directly with staff through app-based systems. I mean, from a ministry perspective, the easy answer would be, okay, we have already heard that the German supply chain law is agnostic to the tools, right? So in the end, it's the responsibility of the reporting company to make sure that the tools that are used are appropriate, that the situation, that make sure that that the picture is accurate. So we we don't have a view on that, but we will monitor along the report that we get under the law, the choice of tooling and the efficiency that we see in these tools, and investigate which the most promising paths to get to a good and a validated and a complete picture on the ground. Maybe Tom, do you want to chime in with more experience from maybe BA's perspective, because you will have faced the situation for longer, I guess.
Many different angles. Civil society is of course involved in the design of the data models and the passport. That's one contribution. With the experience, what people bring from the situation on the ground, that we are modeling this into the data field. The second aspect is certainly to have very conscious eye on the situation on the ground and report in parallel to what's coming through passport and digital tools if there is something really happening in the real world. And thirdly, I believe that industry needs to maintain the dialogue with all those stakeholders, because change is made by people, and people need to speak with people. It's not just a delegation to a digital tool. Digital tool can support, but are nothing where you can delegate the responsibility for the own action to. That's still a matter what people need to drive. And I see this in the own company. This aspect of sustainability and safety is very high on the agenda, and that filters into a company's culture. If all employees are aware and we have a sufficient critical mass being aware and act, then we have achieved a lot more than just building up a tool and then stepping away.
Thorsten, this is almost a perfect closing statement, but I have one last round of questions for you, because I made a promise. To Andreas Hubert that we will ask about, that I will ask you, how will collaboration and standardization happen in your respective industries? Of course, the battery passport is an example of its own, but in, for you, Janina, and for Frank, which platforms, collective platforms, are you using to advance standardization on digital tools and the data collected across suppliers? I'm keen to get back to Andreas with your insights. Frank, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, most probably Andreas will know my answer, because he has overall in this actual has been so close to our program. I mean, we are a participating company in the Fair Labor Association, which is a good hub for exchanging information. The FLA is certainly a strong competence center for program development, but it allows companies to collaborate, to engage, and to standardize specific programmatic procedure, which from my point of view is a very, very first step. If it comes to a clear point of view in terms of terminology, harmonized standard setting, which then can be conveyed in a meaningful, let's say, data tool.
Yeah.
As I mentioned, the Fair Factory Clearinghouse, which is a tool which is used by many, many other players, at least in our industry, and it supports a number of other multi-stakeholder forums with data deliveries. That's an opportunity, and there are certainly a number of others, because you know, I think pretty well, Dorothy, how, let's say, how fragmented our industry is. Always good intentions, but there's always very strong confidence of the players who believe that they found the right approach. But again, if it comes to that pre-competitive field, I do think collaboration, standardization is absolutely critical in the long term, because looking at the upcoming legislative developments,
yes.
if it's the EU taxonomy, if it's the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, if it's the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, this is something we as an industry have to develop a response for. And the response must be based on standardized approaches.
Yeah, I agree. Janina, is there an equivalent to the Fair Labor Association in the pharma industry?
We built around like 10 years ago, a little bit more than 10 years ago, and platforms, the Tool Industry Initiative I've been referring to in the beginning, and Together for Sustainability and Pharmaceutical Supply Chain Initiative, to find a common ground for sustainability indicators for the chemical and the pharmaceutical industry. However, what we are also looking for is, since we have also a seed business, which is not really chemical, which is not pharmaceutical at all, where Frank, we are much more common with your industry on what other industries already did, looking on FLA, what kind of common grounds they already pay forward. And when we are seeing where our risk is not with our direct supplier, but beyond, leaning on the activities which are already there. When I'm looking on our palm oil activities, we're going to the standards of the responsible roundtable on palm. When we're looking on soy, we're going to the roundtable on soy. When we're looking on minerals, we're looking on conflict minerals, because also our industry is on the first tier. It's the pharmaceutical or chemical industry. The second you leave the first tier, we have almost all industries somewhere in our supply chain. So leaning on the great work of other industries would be my answer here, paving the way forward for the core parts of an own industry, and then really relying and leaning on the other industries.
Final question to Tim: how does regulation encourage companies to work on such collective platforms, to harmonize tools, to harmonize data? Is there any explicit incentive to actually work together? And is this something that could be incentivized?
Well, that's a good question. I think as for the battery industry, I think it is just obvious that we need a very close collaboration along the value chain. We're also seeing this in the European ecosystem, that there is already some growing together, because there is also a collective challenge of making this happen in Europe, and also the collective goal to make it happen in the most sustainable way, because everyone knows that if we do not succeed in making electric vehicles really contribute to CO2 reduction by having good batteries produced in a favorable way, then we will all lose in the end, right? So I think this sort of collective mission really helps, because all the players need that they in the end will need to work together to make this happen, and that sort of black sheeps will be sorted out, right? Because in the end, it's the OEMs, like always, pushing the envelope, and looking also at their CO2 footprints. So everyone needs to strive to improve on the sustainability in the environmental domain, but also, of course, on the human rights domain, because it is just not acceptable to have minerals sourced under difficult conditions in your vehicles. That's I think clear for everyone, and this is a genuine economic incentive then, which stems from the wish to to stay in that value chain also while the requirements in terms of sustainability are increased by regulation, but also by customer expectancy. And I think this is one aspect, and the other aspect is that there's of course also business opportunities in there. The details of that, as for the batteries, are yet to be defined, right? So even the battery regulation as we have it specifies the data exchange on a rather high level. So there are implementing acts, there's pilots like the ones we are pushing who are working out the details. But of course, I mean, data is power. Access to data means business opportunities. The Commission and also us will make sure that there is no monopolies being formed in that domain. This is also clear. But I think it's not yet decided who will win on the data side and on the creating business opportunities on the data side. So this is also an incentive in being an early mover and gaining an advantage. So I think this is all working into the right direction. There's no need to regulate everything. We just need to make sure that the framework is there, that there's plurality, that the voices of civil society are heard, are reflected in the process. And well, with this in mind, I hope that the battery field can serve as a blueprint also for other industries.
That's great. Tim, I'm very happy that we're landing on this optimistic note. And very grateful that you pointed out that the data tools need to accelerate a green, but also a just transition. There are no trade-offs. We need environment and human rights advancing in parallel with enablers such as data and digital tools. I learned a lot. I greatly enjoyed this conversation. I thank the audience. I thank you, panelists, and of course, the organizers who brought us all together. And wish you a good afternoon. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much also from my part.
Thank you.
Yes.
It was nice to have you here. I think we learned a lot from your experience, from the companies, from the initiatives. And it looks like that there are a lot of digital opportunities, tools and initiatives like the Global Battery Alliance that can help achieving more transparency and traceability. But there seems to be also common sense in this discussion that digitalization can only be an enabler and doesn't substitute a personal engagement or, like you put it, Dorothy, a human touch to make digitalization work. I think we all learned a lot, and thank you for this informative and engaging discussion. Thank you for the audience for joining us. Our series on international trade going digital continues tomorrow with 10 a.m. on efficiency and fraud prevention in the digital area, and it's 2 p.m. on paperless trade and beyond. I hope many of you will be able to join, and I'm very much looking forward to it. Thanks again to everyone for joining, and stay tuned.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.